Okay, hi everyone. So this is probably going to be one of my final Blender pre-recorded videos. And what I'm doing is in response to what we discussed yesterday, where you mentioned a bunch of different directions you'd like to go in your own Blender work, I've put together this scene that is really just an introduction to a whole lot of different techniques you can use. And then I'm going to link to this video some more specific tutorials that go into the techniques that I've used here with a more professional level of detail. So I'd like you to treat this as an introduction to showing you how a bunch of different functions can be incorporated into your work. And if I show you the scene that I've rendered out, I think the sound might not work, but basically what we've got is an animated figure. So I'll show you how to import a pre-made human figure and animate it. And also these buildings that are popping up and down are being driven by a piece of music. So I'm going to show you how to use music as a driving force in your animation. And this could be a really interesting tool for you to use, especially if you're working with sound in Cedric's class. The other thing you'll notice is I've used depth of field in this camera setting. So if we look here, the figure is in focus and these buildings in the background are out of focus. And I've done a little bit of 3D sculpting here for those of you who were interested in 3D sculpting. Obviously it's not particularly good 3D sculpting, but it's just going to introduce the tool and how you can use it. And what I'm also going to show is a bunch of online resources for downloading these HDRI lighting images, resources for downloading pre-made 3D models like these buildings and the human figure, and also online resources for downloading sound and also color schemes to help you progress further in how you want to use color. Okay, so let's get into it. This is the scene here, and basically I'll make it from scratch and show you where I got all the objects and how it all works. Okay, so I'll just start a new scene by hitting Command N and go to General. I'll keep those changes. And okay, so here we are back at the beginning. First thing I'll do is I'll delete the default cube, and I'm going to download a human figure from the internet. So this is the website where I got my human figure from, turbosquid.com, and I'm going to search for human. And I'll also set a filter for, yes, I think I'd already set it. I was going to set the price filter to free because you know, when you're starting out, I think it's good to use free models because often, you know, you don't know what you want and it's not the greatest time to be spending lots of money on things that might not be actually what you need. So start out with some free 3D models. And this is a model I downloaded here, Carla Rigged. Actually, I'll just go back and show you. If you hover over any of these search results, it'll tell you the file types that they're available in. And this file here is available in Max, Cinema 4D, FBX, Unity, and it's the FBX that we want. FBX is a highly sort of standard file type for 3D models. OBJ is also, you know, OBJ here is also a very transferable file type. The other thing we want is, see how it says rigged, Carla Rigged, and this skeleton you see in the background, or these triangles inside the body, this is what's going to allow us to animate the figure and to make it move around. So I've just, you know, you'll just have to make a free account and then you'll probably add this to your shopping cart and go ahead and download it. And if I go back to Blender and into my Finder, I've set up the same folder hierarchy to what we used in our previous tutorials, and I've put the human figure in an assets folder. And assets is just a common name for the sort of files and objects that you use, usually 3D objects in a scene or in a game. And so our asset of the human rigged figure is here, and then these are all the files here. So to import, we go File, Import, what did we get? We got an FBX, didn't we? FBX. And I'll just go back to this directory, go into my assets folder, pick Carla Rigged, and we're going to use this one, Carla Rigged Z Up, because when we're in Blender, our Z axis is our up axis. So that's perfectly fine. So if I go into Look Dev mode, we'll just check we've got all the textures connected. We do, that's excellent. I might just turn off, I think I've got my screen a little bit orange. There we go, that's a bit better. Okay, so there's our human figure. Next, I'm going to show you how to animate the figure a little bit later in the tutorial. I'm just going to set up the rest of the scene first. So next, let's do some of this 3D sculpting business. So I'm in object mode, I'm going to go Shift A, and I'll add a cube. And I'll just bring it along on the y-axis. Now I'll link a tutorial to 3D sculpting in the description, but I'll just give you a very basic introduction of how 3D sculpting works. So let's just subdivide the cube with a subdivision surface modifier here. Now simple will keep our square shape, Catmull Clark will sort of eventually turn it into a sphere. So I might go somewhere in between. I might go back into edit mode and just subdivide it once. So we sort of keep a part cube, part rounded edge form, and I'll set those up quite high to 5 each, and I'll apply. So now we've got, if I press tab, a heavily subdivided cube. Now pop over into sculpting mode, and it'll put on this sort of metallic bronze shader. And I'll just set up a couple of things before I get started with the sculpting. If I press N to bring up these properties menus here, I want to look at Tool, and I want to turn on Dyne Topo, which means dynamic topology. And what that means, that's okay, is that as we sculpt, it will add new topology. It will add new polygons to our mesh. So that means we won't just be pulling and pushing the form around, but we'll be creating more detail as we sculpt, which is sort of what we need. And I'll set the detailing to constant detail, and there's explanations of all of this in the more detailed tutorials on 3D sculpting. But just to give you a very basic view, if I set the radius in the draw tool, I've set the radius up a little bit, and so now if I click here, okay, something's happening, but it's not quite what we want. We're pulling out these polygons, but we're pulling out huge polygons, and I just need to turn the resolution on this dynamic topology up. So I'll just Command Z and get out of that. I'll turn this resolution up to, say, 20. So now if I click here, you can see that the drawing tool is sort of expanding out the edges of that square that I'm clicking on. And you'll also notice that it's doing it symmetrically. The reason it's doing that is that in the symmetry option here, Mirror X is turned on. So I might just, do a little bit more here. We'll keep some of that mirroring for now. But if I turn this off, and say I sculpt here or here, it's not mirroring anywhere else. So I'll just undo that. The next thing we can do is if I press Shift and click, we're going to push in rather than drag out. So if I push in here, you should see that maybe I need to turn the strength on this up a bit. It's not doing a great deal. Hold on. I'll grab it out here and now push it back in. Yeah, so Shift should usually reverse the sculpting tool, and it will push the form back in rather than pull it out. But there's probably some better tools we could be using. So let's have a look at this is a nice one, clay strips. If we add clay strips, it's very much a very sculptural thing. You can see that it's adding, if I make it smaller it might be easier to see, it's adding these sort of layers of mesh as if you were a sculptor adding on pieces of clay. So we could sculpt our form this way, and similarly if I press Shift, let me just get a little bit more detail on my on my form, if I press shift now, it should start to smooth out or remove some of these areas. What's this one here? Crease. If I crease here, you can see it's kind of pinching the surface in here. And maybe I'll turn some of my symmetry on and I'll just start playing around. 3D sculpting, there are some excellent tutorials that show you sculpting approaches to particular things. You know, if you wanted to sculpt a rock or if you wanted to sculpt a human face or something like that, there are excellent tutorials that sort of show you how to get started. I'm really just randomly playing with some of these tools, and I'm just making this shape that I'll eventually just sit our human figure on. What else have we got here? Inflate. What will inflate do? Okay, we're sort of inflating the mesh like a balloon here. And what if I get my drawing tool, make it a bit smaller? I could sort of make some strange bumps here. You know, this, I'm really just making a random shape here. If you want to get into 3D sculpting, you can use this to make quite beautiful, you know, rocks or faces or other organic forms. But you know, this will work just fine for what our figure is going to stand on. One thing you might notice when you're 3D sculpting is that if you do this for too long, or if you sort of set, the higher you set the resolution on the dynamic topology, the better the detail will get. But because it's adding more detail as you sculpt in real time, eventually you might notice the viewport of Blender slowing down, and that will be because the amount of polygons in your scene will be getting very, very large. So, you know, again, and there are ways that you can do that. You can remesh your sculpture and do all sorts of things. But I'll refer you to more detailed tutorials for that. So that's going to be the weird sort of, I don't know, cushion, strange shape that our figure will stand on. So I'm going to pop back into modeling here. And so now if I press tab, here's that thing that I've just 3D sculpted. So I'll scale it down. I'll go into my top-down view, and I'll grab it, and let's just put it underneath the feet of our human model. Next thing we might do is, I might just do a few little things. I might just set my frame rate to 30 frames per second. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make that sort of mountain background that we had before, and I wanted to show you this because it's starting to show some other ways that we can integrate data from other sources into Blender and sort of do a little bit of simple data visualization. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this website here. It's called terrain.party, and at the moment I've got it set to Hong Kong, but when you go to this website, it'll start in Tampere, Finland, which I imagine is where the developers of the website are from. And so basically we can grab this little square here with the left click of our mouse, and we kind of have to drag it. I'm going to drag it to Hong Kong just for some familiarity, I guess. And my computer is lagging a little bit, but you know, if I zoom out, I'm going to drag it across to Eastern Europe. There it is. Drag it across China, and let's find where we are here. Here we are, and I'm going to put it right over Kowloon Tong, and you can make the rectangle smaller. I think the smallest you can make it is 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers, and let's just put it right over Kowloon Tong. So we should have some, what this is going to do is it's going to grab the mountains around Lion Rock, and it should be some of the flat area near Sha Tin and Kowloon Tong. So once I've selected my area, I can go to export, and I can call it, I'm going to call it Lion Rock 2, and I'll hit OK. I've actually already downloaded this, so I don't know if I really need to download it again. But once I've downloaded, I will get a zip file, and I'll just put that zip file, I think I put it here in my textures folder. And what you'll find are all these black and white images. And the one we're going to use is this one, height map merged. And if I just preview it, what it is three-dimensional data compressed into two-dimensional pixel coordinates, and then pixels, so it's a bitmap image where the height of the mountains, the third dimension, has been compressed into values of either black or white. So white, we can kind of see what's going on here. White is the highest, this is the mountain ridge, and black is the flat area. So I'm guessing, Sha Tin must be around here somewhere, Kowloon Tong must be around here. And basically, using Blender, we can, I guess in a way, decompress or re-visualize this as a three-dimensional form. And I'll show you how to do that. So let's go back into Blender, and first of all, I'll create a plane. I'll scale it up. Well, that's probably good enough. I'm going to apply its scale, so Control A, apply scale. I will just tab and subdivide it, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. So that was just me pressing right click in edit mode and hitting subdivide. Then in edit mode with all the faces selected, I will press U and unwrap, so it's got some UVs. Now I'll go into my modifying panel, and with 2 modifiers we'll get this landscape. The first one we want is a subdivision surface, and I'm going to put the subdivisions at simple so we keep our sharp corners, and I'll put this up to 4, should be enough. And then I'm going to use a displacement modifier, and the displacement, I'm going to drive it using an image. So I'll go over to these toggles on the right, click the toggles, new image, open image, and I'll go back to my project directory, and I'll go into textures, line rock terrain, and height map merged, and I'll open that image. So we can see that something's happened, but it's not, it's not exactly what we want. We can see that we've got a repeating pattern here rather than the scale of the mountains we wanted, but we can fix that. First of all, maybe I need to up the subdivisions a bit more. I'll put them much higher at 6, and you can see now kind of what's going on. We've got these same mountains repeated over and over again. So I just want to change the textual coordinates here to UV. So because we made that UV map, it should have mapped it now accurately to the UV map. And now we can adjust the strength. And the strength is basically saying, how high should a white pixel be and how low should a black pixel be. And I'm not sure from terrain.party what the actual accurate height would be conversion-wise in Blender. But here, we're not doing geographical survey work, so I just set that at, let's set it at 4. It looks kind of cool, and maybe it's a little bit higher than the mountains here, but it looks nice. Okay, so we can actually just leave the modifiers here, and what I'll do is I'll bring this up, and maybe I'll bring everything up a bit. So I'll just grab everything, grab it on the Z-axis, and bring it up. Okay, so what have we done, and now what haven't we done? Okay, so we've implemented the terrain, we've imported the figures. Oh, actually, let's make those buildings. So to bring in the buildings, I will go back to TurboSquid. Okay, and instead of human, I'll type in building. And I'll set the price to free. And actually, I used the first building that popped up, which is this one here. And it's in both OBJ and FBX. And I think I downloaded it in OBJ from memory. Let's just have a look. So if I go back here, look in my assets, the apartment building asset, yes, I downloaded an OBJ. So I'll go back into Blender, File, Import OBJ, and in my assets folder, apartment building OBJ. Now, the building has come in absolutely enormous, but that's not a problem. Let's just hit scale, 0.01, enter. I'll zoom back in, and that's now a lot smaller. Let's do S.1 again. That's better. So now it's nice and little. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller scale, 0.8. And I'll grab it on the y-axis so we can see. And I'm just going to sort of get rid of its default materials actually, because I'm just going for more of a sort of abstract look. So I'll go into its materials tab, and I just had to click off the building and click on it again to make sure I just had that building selected so I could see its materials. And I'm just going to hit this minus button and take all those materials off. And I'll just add a new material, and we'll come to that later, but I'll call it building. So let's make the building a bit taller. I'll add an array modifier, change the axis. I'm going to put that at 0.9, so I've got a little bit of an overlap, and I'll make it 5 buildings high. And I'm going to apply that modifier now. Now, one thing I'm going to do, which I don't think we've discussed yet, is I'm going to change the pivot point or the origin of the object. And I'll show you what the origin does. If I rotate this on the y-axis, the object is rotating around its pivot point or its object. And right-click to get out of that. But I want the pivot point to be in the center. And this is really just for how our animation is going to work. And you know, if you're making a door, you can imagine if this was, let's say, a lot longer like this, and this was a door, having the pivot point on the edge of an object is actually exactly how a door should work. You know, it should rotate like this. Now let's just get my original scale back. Okay. So, but I want to have our pivot point to be in the center of our object. So we go into Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry. And now if I rotate this around the y-axis, you can see it's rotating around its central point. And that's just going to help out our animation a little bit later. I'm just going to go into my top view, and I'm going to duplicate this building. I'll put another one here, another one here, and another one here. And there's my kind of symbolic representation of Hong Kong. Tall buildings sandwiched between mountains. Okay, now how's our translation here? What I might do is just, I might move all these buildings down a little bit, because I sort of wanted them just kind of growing out of the ground like that. Okay, so now we've got our buildings into the scene. The next thing I'm going to do is set up a camera, because there's a few things with setting up cameras we haven't covered yet. So if I go into my animation tab, you can see there's already a camera in the scene, and that's the default camera that's been set up. So I'll actually use that camera because it's already pointing at a nice angle to the middle of our scene. But I'm going to show you another trick that will give us a lot of control for animating the camera around our central figure without having to do a lot of complicated stuff in calculating the rotation of the camera. So the way we'll do that is Shift A, I'll add an empty plane axis, and I'll grab it on the Z axis, and I just want to put that empty where our central figure is. And you know, we can call that empty camera aim. And now if I go to the camera and into the constraints tab, which is down here, I'm going to add object constraint track to. So I want the camera to track to this empty. So therefore the target will be camera aim, which is that empty. And then we've just got to get the parameters doing the correct thing, which I believe should be -Z and up being Y. So now if I G and grab that camera, you'll see that no matter where I move the camera, it's always pointing at our figure. And this is going to make it really easy to keyframe a kind of nice sweeping camera movement. And of course, we can also move and keyframe the empty. So this is a great way to have a nice kind of smooth control over your camera. Okay, so the camera is all set up. Maybe the next thing we'll do, let's just fill out the scene a bit more. I'm going to add, let's just go into, what render engine are we in? Okay, we're in Eevee, that's good. I'll go into rendered mode. And so far, I think we've got, we should have some materials on the figure. but nothing else so far. So I'm going to add in that environment texture that you saw at the beginning, and I'll show you, this is a great website here, hdrihaven.com, and it just has thousands of HDR 360 degree images that you can use for lighting and reflection reference in Blender, or also just to kind of play around with as backgrounds as well. So I've downloaded one of those to, I think, my textures folder perhaps. Textures, Lakeside HDR. So I downloaded this. I thought it looked kind of cool. Okay, so we'll go back into Blender, color. So I'm in the world tab here. Color, environment texture, and I have to set it to my file. So open file. Let's go back into our project directory, textures, Lakeside HDR, open image. And okay, now we've got our lakeside and our figure looking wistfully out towards the lake or to the horizon. But we need some color for our objects. One online resource I wanted to show you is this website here. This is color.adobe.com. And what this website does is it basically automates formalist 20th century color theory. So for those of you who've studied painting, you should know, the terms like analogous colors, monochromatic, triads, complementary color relationships, etc. And basically, I'm just going to base something off our skin tone here, which will be somewhere in kind of an orange range, is usually where most skin tones are. And I'll make, let's just do something really simple, a complementary color relationship. So if I find there's kind of a skin tone color in there somewhere, yeah, maybe that'll be enough for us, because this also is kind of not that different from some of the colors we have in our background image. So you can play with this a lot more. The really important thing I wanted to show you is how you can use these color values here directly in Blender or in any other software you like. So let's put, I don't know, the dark blue on the ground and the light blue on the buildings. Let's try that. So if I grab the ground here, go into its shader, add a new shader here in its materials, we'll call this one ground, and let's grab, what did I say? The dark blue. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this value here, and this is what's called a hex value. And if I go into the base color and I set this to hex, I can just paste that value in there, and now that blue has been brought straight in. So let's do the same for the buildings. The building, we already put that building material on, and let's use the light blue. Grab that here and paste it into the hex value like so. So now we've got light blue buildings, and maybe for the complement, maybe we'll put this color here on the weird cloud thing that I 3D sculpted. Okay, hex, like so. Okay, so now we've kind of got that color scheme running through our scene. Okay, so that's the color setup. The next thing I want to do is I want to show you how to use sound to drive animation. And the animations we're going to drive is going to be the height of these buildings. I want them to sort of jump up and down using a sound file. So the website I used to grab the sound was this one here, freesound.org. And you just sort of make an account and you can download sounds that people have uploaded, and also pay attention to the licenses that they've given you. This is under a Creative Commons license, but usually in the comments they should tell you if you use it, whether you have to credit the author, etc. And that's always kind of the polite thing to do. Right, so to have these buildings jump up and down, what we need to do first is we need to put a keyframe on the Z location, because that's going to be the height, and only the Z location. So I'm going to insert a single keyframe. If I keyed all of these, if I did insert keyframes and had keys here, then through this process we could have the sound making the building move on the X and Y axis as well, and I don't want that. So I'll delete these keyframes and just add this single keyframe on the Z location. And I'll just repeat that. I'm pressing the letter I here to repeat that last keyframe operation. So now all these buildings have a keyframe on the Z translation. Next, if we go into the graph editor, where are we? Graph editor, and we've got this keyframe here. We can go key, and this is the function we're going to use, bake sound to F curves. And this is a really powerful function because it's another, much like what we did with the landscape, it's another form of data visualization where the input from, in this case, the sound, is going to create visual, 3D graphics. And whilst we're just using it for the height of the buildings, you could also use it to control, various things on a displacement surface. You could have polygons jumping around or changing shape, all sorts of things. So this is a really powerful property, using sound to drive animation. So we'll bake sound to F curves, and I'll go back to our directory, and now in the audio folder I just downloaded a track from that free audio website. And for each building, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a different frequency range for each building, and that should give us some interesting variations. So here I'm going to use the lowest frequency, 0 to 100, and if I hit bake and now I scrub down the timeline, we'll see that our building is jumping up. And if you want to hear the sound alongside your animation so you can see what it's doing, all you have to do is just go into, I just do it through the video editing, I bring up this timeline, I shift A, I add the sound, go back to my audio directory, and now when I press play, I'm actually hearing that sound, and therefore, when I watch this, you probably won't hear it in your video, but I can hear that that this building is jumping up to the baseline. And if you're listening to that and the animation doesn't look like it's in sync with the sound, you just need to change a playback setting here. Here it's on no sync, and change it to AV sync. And what that'll mean is that instead of trying to play every single frame at once, Blender will skip frames to try to maintain the overall frame rate of 30 frames per second so that it's in sync with the sound file. Okay, so I'll just go back to frame 1. I'm just going to repeat that process on the other buildings. So this was 0 to 100 on the frequency. So now I'll grab the next building, bake sound to F curves, same sound file, but let's set this at 200 to 500. We're going to just, quickly ramp up these frequencies. And this building, let's go key, bake sound to F curves, and let's go 500 to, 2000. Bake sound to F curves. And on the final building, let's just kind of give it the high range. So key, bake sound to F curves, grab that sound file, and let's pick 2000, not 20,000, 2000 to 10,000. Bake sound to F curves. So now, if I just scrub along the timeline, they should all be, I guess, having their translation affected by different parts of this song. And it sounds like maybe we're not getting much from that high range there. I'll link, there are a number of ways you can sort of fine tune this and clean up the curves of that audio to get more, I guess, clean data for the animation. But this is the first initial move. And then if you're interested in this, I'll give you some much more detailed tutorials that show how you can get quite a lot out of sound-driven animation. Also, I just realized let's make this animation a little bit longer. I've set it now to 500 frames. Okay, so now we've got the sound-driven animation working. I guess the next thing I want to do before we animate our camera is I'll show you how to move the figure. because you've probably been looking at these triangular bones and thinking, you know, what on earth do I do with these? And you'll notice that they don't show up in the render. These are just sort of control points that we use to animate the figure. And if you do some tutorials on character development, you'll see how you can insert your own skeleton and rig your own figure. And basically what this is doing is, if you 3D model a figure like this, you don't actually want to, you can't really animate it just through the mesh. You know, it's sort of the equivalent of trying to move your body if the only thing you could control was your skin. You know, you have to have a skeleton inside that moves a whole large piece of, you know, for us it's blood and flesh and muscles and skin and sinews and blood vessels. For the 3D model, we replicate that by having the external mesh and then binding it to these very simple skeleton structures. So if I click on the armature, I'll show you how it works. If I go into pose mode, and then I'll just grab one of these handles, and if I press G to grab, you'll see it's not quite what we want. It's just bending the mesh around. Usually with these bones we rotate them. So if I rotate this, think of it like rotating your shoulder joint. You know, I can rotate my arm. And same thing if I rotate the leg, rotate on the x-axis, you know, we're getting movements that would be sort of appropriate for a figure like this. So I'll go back to frame 1, and actually what I want to do is keyframe some of these movements. So starting with the leg, let's keyframe the, I'm just going to keyframe sorry, I'll insert keyframes here. I'll keyframe all the rotations here. And I'll grab this knee and do the same, just rotating it on the x-axis. Now if I hit I, it should insert a keyframe into all of them. And with the arm, let's rotate it on the z-axis, and I'll make her clap. Seems like a reasonably okay movement to start with. And again, I'm just doing some really simple movements, and I'll leave it up to you artistically and creatively to decide what exactly you want to do yourselves. So I'm just going to rotate that. Whoop, I shouldn't have I need to rotate that now on the y-axis. So her arm is open like that, and now rotate it on the z-axis so that it's kind of coming in at a clapping motion. But you know, look, I'm doing a very sort of basic job here. So I'll insert a keyframe on that rotation, and I think this one I also want to be a bit rotate on the z-axis, coming in a bit more. That's better. Okay, so now I've keyframed this position for keyframe 1. Let's go to frame number 30, and you know, I'll just set a second position. So with this shoulder bone still selected, I'll rotate it on the z-axis, and you know, let's make a big clap. Insert that, and grab this, rotate on the z-axis. Whoop! Don't want to dislocate her shoulder, and I'll insert that keyframe as well. And let's make the legs switch position. So I'll grab this and rotate on the Z, bring her leg back down, insert this keyframe, and grab this handle, rotate it on the x-axis, insert this keyframe, and then we'll just bring this leg up to a similar sort of position. So rotate on the x-axis, bring the leg up, insert the keyframe, and grab the knee, rotate on the x-axis, and insert the keyframe. So now let's see if that's done what we want. If we scroll back and forth, okay, we've forgotten something. On the first frame, we didn't add any keyframes for this leg. So because it's just got one keyframe, it's not moving, it's just stuck in that position. So we need to put in a starting keyframe for it as well. So let's rotate on the x-axis, insert a keyframe, rotate on the x-axis again, insert a keyframe. Now we should have, okay, the world's most boring dance, but alright, that's good enough for us. So now I'm just going to press A and select all of the control bones on this armature, and I'm going to do some very, very lazy looping here. I'm just going to copy and paste these keyframes so that we've got an endless loop. So if I go to frame, should be frame 60, and I'm going to copy the first keyframe, select all of those, copy, and now that my playhead is on frame 60, I'll hit paste. That should continue on. Good, because we're just basically going from position A to position B, back to position A again. So now to loop this again, if this is A, B, A, we need B, A again, right? So let's go to frame 90, paste these two movements, check that that's all. Yep, that looks good. So now if we go to frame, what would it be, 120? No, we've already got a keyframe there. So 150. So if we've got A, B, A, B, A, we need to start at B again. Copy these, paste. Now remember, there's also modifiers here that you can add in. You know, there are looping modifiers you can use as well. I'm just doing this because it's a very quick and easy way to get our loops working. So 210, add 30 would be 4. No, where are we here? Have I forgotten my times tables? Probably. So, okay, no, so our last keyframe is at frame 240, right? So we want to be at 270. Okay, and then I'll just grab everything starting at B and copy and paste it in. Okay, so now we're pretty much at the end of the animation minus 30 frames. Okay, so there we go. Our character is dancing around endlessly, and our buildings, if we zoom out, should be bopping up and down. And of course, you know, you could bake keyframes of the character to the music as well. You just have to choose which parameter you wanted to bake in. Okay, so I guess I'll just do a couple more things with the camera and then we'll finish up. So let's have a look at the camera. Now, go back to frame 1 and I'll show you how easy it is to use the camera now that we've, oh sorry, I need to go back to object mode and then grab the camera. I'll show you how easy it is to use this camera now that we have parented it or constrained it to this empty. So in the camera view here, I'm just going to go hit N to bring up this menu and then hit view, lock camera to view, just so I can scroll in quickly. And let's start, I'm using middle mouse button to rotate. Let's start with the close-up. And I'm going to insert keyframes on my location and rotation here. And I'm just going to do a very quick animation. Let's go to frame 100. And maybe in frame 100 we zoom out and pivot around like this. And insert keyframe, insert keyframe. And then let's go to frame 300. And we'll zoom out a little bit more. And pan around like this. Insert keyframe, insert keyframe. And then let's go to frame 500, which is our final frame. And you know, let's I'll show you why I'm doing this. I'll go into rendered mode. I'm going to have, we're looking at the horizon like this. Okay, insert keyframe, insert keyframe. So let's see if that worked. Let's go back to the beginning of our timeline here. And if I scroll along the timeline here, you know, we've got this panning movement of our figure clapping and dancing on a cloud while the buildings bop up and down. A couple of things we've left out. We haven't done anything with lighting. So again, I will supply some more advanced lighting tutorials, but this is just really a reminder more than anything. I'll delete the default light. I'll go into my world settings and I'll turn the strength of my environment light down by half. And so you can see the environment light is giving some light already to our scene. I'm going to add in a sun. Let's go Shift A, add a light, sun, and if I grab this sun and bring it up, here it is. And I'm going to rotate my sun on the y-axis. So we're getting some shadows from the buildings there. And I'll turn up the brightness on that light as well. Let's put the strength at 3. That should be quite bright. And now look again, this is not a very sophisticated lighting setup. I'm just putting a light in to remind you that lighting your scene is another important component, and I'll put in some far more sophisticated lighting tutorials. The final thing is let's set the depth of field on our camera. We talked about that a little bit in class. If I click on the camera, and I'm in the camera tab here, I'll turn on depth of field. And a really handy trick is we can just use the eyedropper and click our character, our object RP color rigged, and set the focal point to the object. And for those of you who sort of know photography lingo, we're going to adjust the f-stop, which is the size of the aperture of the sort of imaginary camera. If the f-stop was high at 8, that would mean that the aperture is small and therefore the focal range is high. So a lot of things can be in focus at one time. And we want the opposite. I'm going to make the aperture low, which means, the f-stop low, which makes the aperture wide. The little hole in the camera is quite open. And that means that only some objects can be in focus and other objects are blurred. And it gives us a sort of slightly more interesting photographic look because it's acting more like a camera would act in the real world. Whereas if I turn off depth of field, we can see that everything is now in focus. But depth of field gives a nice sort of blurring. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And remembering that this is not, I'll just go back to my timeline. This is not a particularly sophisticated animation by any stretch. Think about it like a sort of mixtape that's showing you a bunch of different techniques, and I'm going to link you to some really fantastic tutorials that I really want you now to decide for yourselves what areas you'd like to learn more about and to start diving into them. And then once you've started learning new techniques, we can talk about them and we can talk about how we can refine them and some interesting things you can start to use for your final projects. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope that's covered a few of the things that you were interested in, and I will expand on these in more detail with linked tutorials. Okay, thanks a lot everyone. Bye bye.